Welcome to the debate. So today we're going to be looking at a really compelling and often, I think, quite challenging work, Nobuaki Notohara's The Arabs, a Japanese viewpoint. Notohara offers this fascinating and very critical comparison between what he observed in Arab societies and, well, the historical experience of Japan.
And he spent decades in the region, which I think gives his perspective a unique weight. He's holding up a very sharp mirror, reflecting these core dysfunctions that are related not just to governance, but also to deeply rooted patterns of individual conduct.
Right, and the central tension that we want to pull from this material, it's foundational, I think, to understanding these persistent societal challenges. The question really boils down to this: is the widespread presence of these profound issues, like the pervasive oppression, or Alcom as the author often calls it, and a real lack of civic responsibility, is all of that primarily rooted in systemic political failure? I'm going to argue that yes, it is.
Okay. And I'll be arguing that while you can't deny the systemic oppression, that deeper and frankly more stubborn barrier to progress is a deep-seated cultural and psychological resistance to self-critique, to nukt al-dati. I think the failure originates within the collective's inability to prioritize individual responsibility over just, conforming to the group.
My position is based firmly on the political environment that Notohara describes so meticulously. My core thesis is that all this societal apathy, the chaos, the failure of individual responsibility, it's all a direct and, frankly, rational consequence of a political structure defined by the absence of social justice. غياب العدالة الاجتماعية. I mean, when justice is systematically denied, the law itself just becomes ineffective, and that leads, as Notohara says, to widespread chaos and human rights violations. Political repression is really the key mechanism here, preventing any kind of reform. The author talks about systematic censorship of books, the press, the stifling of free expression. This isn't some sort of cultural preference. It is state policy. It's designed to eliminate accountability. So consequently, when a citizen fails to take responsibility for, let's say, public property, it isn't some deep cultural flaw. It's an ingrained, though destructive, symptom of alienation. I mean, why would you protect a bus or a park when the state treats that asset as its own private possession, completely disconnected from you?
I think that analysis, while it definitely acknowledges the political system, it kind of misses the cultural foundation that allows that system to persist in the first place. I agree political systems impose these huge restraints, but the more profound problem that Notohara identifies is the collective's adherence to what he calls a single pattern, al-Namat al-Wahid, of thought. This single pattern just dissolves individual autonomy and, with it, critical thinking. Think about the contrast he gives us. Japan's really difficult and painful process of self-correction after World War II. It was this essential national reckoning that allowed them to reform. And then he asks, very pointedly, how long will it take the Arab world to apply that same rigor and correct its own path? That question really confirms that the internal, the psychological hurdle, this failure to apply nukt al-dhahi, self-critique, is the essential impediment. When individual identity, istiqlaliyat al-fard, just melts away into the collective, well, responsibility towards the wider nation also dissipates. It's an internal cultural failure. Think about the contrast he gives us.
Okay, let's dissect that relationship between the state and the citizen on public ownership, because I think the political structure dictates the limits of that responsibility. You're claiming that destroying public property reflects a failure of internal character. I would maintain it's a symptom of political alienation that escalates into this destructive rage, precisely because the state has basically privatized the entire public sphere for its own benefit.
A failure of basic civic culture, yes.
But Notohara explicitly links suppression and failure to feel responsible to the visible destruction of public assets. When citizens see the transit system or the schools not as shared goods, but as the spoils of a corrupt regime that actively oppresses them, well, destroying them becomes an expression of political spite. It's a response to being completely disempowered. How can we possibly expect the sense of ownership when the citizen has no constitutional claim, no voice, and no way to hold anyone accountable for those assets?
I understand the argument, I do, that destruction is a symptom of rage. But I'm I'm sorry, I just find that a bit too convenient as an excuse for what is a breakdown of basic communal ethics. If the assets were just the government's, simple neglect would be enough. But the destructive act itself, breaking public phones, vandalizing buses, as the author describes, that suggests a failure of internal character that goes beyond just a political grievance. It's a failure to recognize your neighbor, the fellow citizen who also needs that service to work. And furthermore, if an individual's conscience and responsibility were robust, they should still manifest despite political oppression. The failure to internalize that civic duty means that even if the government were magically reformed tomorrow, this destructive behavior would likely persist until the underlying cultural mindset shifts away from pure self-interest. The lack of responsibility is less a reaction to oppression and more a sort of a pre-existing condition that oppression then exploits. And this brings us right to the nature of oppression itself, Alkem. I'd argue that yes, the political system imposes it, but the perpetuation of oppression is reinforced by internal social dynamics. Notohara observes that the society is structured so that the clan, the tribe, the religious group, they hold this overwhelmingly high status relative to the individual. And that dynamic ensures that oppression stays pervasive because the individual is frankly terrified of taking a singular, responsible position that deviates from the group's single pattern. They willingly accept the terms of Alkem because that group identity shields them from the scary prospect of being truly autonomous.
That's a compelling point about the group structure. But the mechanism that enforces oppression on a national scale is fundamentally political and legal. When it reaches the systematic level Notara sees, it's maintained by making every individual subject to the arbitrary will of the ruler and their inner circle, not the rule of law. The privileges the ruling class enjoys aren't just cultural, they are legal exemptions. The real failure is when the law itself is rendered impotent against the elite. Think about the Japanese counterexample he cites, the Tanaka case. A former Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka was implicated in a huge bribery scandal. But crucially, the Japanese police and the independent media were able to investigate and expose this corruption, which led to his prosecution. That is a stark contrast to systems where the ruling class uses its status to commit crimes with impunity, maintained by a pliant judiciary. The impunity of the oppressor is a structural political guarantee, not just a cultural comfort. And let's move to the idea of self-correction, which Notohara uses as this key comparison. Japan's post-war correction of errors took decades and, critically, massive systemic pressure. It wasn't some pure internal moral awakening. It was born out of the massive destruction caused by the US, the occupation, and the absolute necessity of reconstruction. My point is that internal moral imperatives, like self-critique, were secondary to the structural necessity that was imposed by this shock. This suggests that to really break the cycle of oppression, you need massive systemic shocks, whether it's revolution or external pressure, to dismantle the entrenched political institutions first, asking for rigorous self-critique, nukt edati, from a population that's been disempowered, and asking for that to be the primary engine of change. You're asking for a moral revolution without addressing the political environment that actively punishes moral dissent.
That's a powerful point about the severity of the shock. But I would argue that Notohara's focus on the Japanese experience highlights the value, the necessity, really, of applying sharp self-criticism regardless of that external shock. If the system collapses, but the underlying cultural inability to recognize error persists, the society just rebuilds the same oppressive structures under a new name. The core lesson, I think, is this. The duty of the individual is to apply that painful self-critique before attempting to reform the structure. Without that internal realization of error, without the willingness to reject the single pattern, any structural adjustment, whether forced by war or revolution, is probably going to fail. We see examples of systemic collapses that just lead to new forms of autocratic control because the citizenry lacked the foundation of critical thought and individual responsibility. The moral groundwork has to be laid internally first.
This brings us back to dignity, or karma. I think we both agree that the desire for dignity is central. However, the realization of dignity depends on the individual's inner strength. their ability to take full responsibility for their life and their civic duties. If someone relies on the government or the clan for their safety, their sustenance, their favors, they are willingly sacrificing their individual dignity for the security that the collective provides. This cultural reliance, which is fostered by rejecting individual autonomy, is what makes the individual perpetually vulnerable to oppression.
I recognize that cultural inclination, but the political system actively institutionalizes that vulnerability. Notohara uses the dictionary definition of dignity, which is tied to the individual not needing to ask favors from others. Yet the current systems actively force people into dependency, and in doing so they strip away their dignity. He cites tangible examples. Needing to ask for favors from some arbitrary official just to conduct basic business, the humiliating treatment at airports, the reliance on patronage just to get a job. These are systemic deficiencies that result from a complete lack of social justice. The state doesn't just exploit a pre-existing cultural dependency, it mandates new forms of personal subservience to maintain its control. It turns dignity into a privilege granted by the ruler, not a right protected by law.
But the cultural failure to define dignity in terms of inner strength, of moral and intellectual self-sufficiency, means that when a favor is granted, the individual just accepts the subservience as a necessary transaction. They don't demand that the system itself operate impartially. The political corruption is efficient precisely because the individual is already conditioned to seek security from the group or from the ruler rather than from the law.
I think we agree that the systems are mutually reinforcing, but the scale of the state's power, its control over resources, means the political system holds the structural veto. The state's ability to enforce censorship, to prosecute critics while shielding its own, that means the lack of social justice is the engine that drives this degradation.
No hit.
So, to summarize my perspective, the societal issues Notohara raises, the apathy, the lack of ownership, the endemic oppression, they're all fundamentally driven by systemic breakdown. The chronic absence of democracy and social justice creates a political environment where individual responsibility is stifled because the citizen is deliberately disempowered. Until the political structure ceases to be divorced from the rule of law, individual responsibility is just a non-starter. Systemic reform, in my view, has to be the prerequisite for any kind of cultural awakening of civic duty.
And to summarize my position, while the systemic issues are severe, the cultural inertia, the refusal to engage in rigorous self-critique, in naqd al-dati, and the difficulty in establishing individual autonomy, that represents the fundamental internal obstacle. Political systems are opportunistic. They exploit this existing cultural vulnerability. Real change requires a shift away from that suffocating single-pattern mindset and an internal realization of civic duty regardless of the political conditions. As Notohara suggests, unless the society learns to self-correct its own errors, any external or systemic shift is just going to be temporary.
I think this exchange really highlights the profound tension that Notohara's work illuminates. That whole chicken or the egg relationship between political oppression and cultural inertia. It forces us to confront whether change has to come from the top down through institutions or from the bottom up through personal and moral transformation.
Right. The material offers this valuable, very stark challenge, forcing us to consider where the emphasis for true, lasting change must ultimately lie. And the value of this perspective, coming from a Japanese viewpoint, is its insistence that self-critique isn't just an intellectual exercise, but a moral imperative, and that makes the relationship between structure and self the defining complexity here.